People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. On this episode, I am talking with Eddie McNamara all about his new book, Zodiactually, the real story of a fake serial killer. It is a bombshell, and I had a great time reading this book, having never read about the Zodiac before, really only knowing things from Fincher's movie and maybe a talk I attended a few years ago, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in this episode. Yeah, I relate a lot of stuff to Fincher's film because it's my point of reference. Hopefully that's not too annoying, but maybe you're like me. Maybe you just know Zodiac from the movie. So hopefully you will enjoy this interview because I definitely had a great time talking with Mr. McNamara. Pick up Zodiactually from Feral House today. Before we start talking about Zodiactually, I really want to know a little bit more about you. Can you tell me kind of your history and how you became a writer?
I'm from Brooklyn, born and raised. I went to college. I studied English, worked in advertising for a year. I couldn't stand it, so I became a cop because I was sleeping on my parents' couch and I needed a job with like benefits and, retirement. So I did that. And I did that for 7 years. I was a 9/11 first responder and kind of a last responder too. I was down there for 9 months doing recoveries. And in 2007, I was able to retire with a line of duty pension because of 9/11 and my PTSD and like kind of agoraphobia and panic disorder. I don't drive anymore. So like a lot happened there. And before I was 30, I had to like remake my life. So I cooked in school. I did a bunch of cooking. I ended up with some magazine gigs, wrote a cookbook, realized I like writing better than cooking, and got obsessed with the Zodiac case during COVID. I wrote a great book from Jared Kobeck, and I decided I wanted to look into it. And I figured with my background, I would look at the police reports and the FBI reports, and I was like, oh, this does not add up. And then I've been researching now for, I guess, like 5 years, 3 years full. I wrote the book that I do at Feral House. Christina's great. And here we are.
Were you interested in the Zodiac before that time or just picked this up with that book?
I loved the movie. I loved the Fincher film. And I was aware of the case from like America's Most Wanted and from sort of like 80s trash TV during like the Satanic Panic years. I was aware of it, but I wasn't particularly interested. I didn't do any kind of deep dive into it. I like Kobeck as a writer, and I was reading a book about Patty Hearst, the one called Eris. I was reading that, and then I read Kobeck's book about Zodiac, and I decided that, San Francisco in the late 60s, early 70s seemed like the wildest place, and I wanted to research as much as possible. And you're home during COVID, so you have a lot of time. And, I'm waking up at 4 a.m, so I'm doing from like 4 to 9, like, just researching this stuff. Then, I really got fully invested in it because I think the thing that really bothered me was in the FBI files, the only person mentioned as a Zodiac letter writer was Dave Toschi, who was Mark Ruffalo's character in the movie. And I couldn't understand why so many Zodiac books out there, the people who wrote the book didn't seem to mention that in the book. So it made me sort of doubt the true crime community's veracity. So I then decided I would do it myself.
How many books do you think have been written about the Zodiac killer?
I think 150. Definitely over 100. Too many, way too many. There's probably 5 that are worthwhile.
I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to bring anybody down, but I happen to see, maybe there's more than one of these guys, but definitely like the guy that you think of when I say the phrase, my dad is the Zodiac killer.
Yes.
I saw him speak once and I was like, all right, maybe I buy this, maybe I don't. And then I saw him speak again, maybe 2 years later. And it was like, oh yeah. And also the Black Dahlia killer.
The Black Dahlia. Yeah. And he has a good case for the Black Dahlia. I read that book years ago, The Black Dahlia Avenger. It's actually a very compelling book. But the problem was the second book. And like my dad's also Zodiac. And there's another new Black Dahlia guy trying to link the Black Dahlia and the Zodiac as the same person. And it's, it's really silly. And the guy, he's coming across very grifty. And I think people can see that already. So there's something very distasteful about a lot of these true crime things. But with some of these Zodiac books, it's people just want to solve a puzzle and bring their solution to the world and pin the blame on a 1960s Bay Area eccentric who never had a parking ticket. And I feel bad for the people. Like, if I'm going to look at somebody for a suspect, they're going to be someone who killed someone or who is involved in violence or who is involved in similar crimes in the area at the same time. A lot of these other people, like, their suspects weren't even in the state of California. They don't know where they were. They could have been in another country. They could have been in, Italy or Vietnam or, another state or, so I don't know. It just doesn't, I think a lot of them are self-published because I don't understand who would put some of this stuff out.
Eddie, how do you even begin to wade through all of the information and try to take that wheat from the chaff and try to figure out what are the facts and what are the fictions?
For me, it's what are the things I can unsee in order to, I know the narrative very well, the Robert Graysmith, David Fincher narrative. I know that very well. And it's a lot of it's factual. A lot of it is based on fact. A lot of it is fictionalized version of fact, but it goes in the right direction. And I was looking at similar crimes in the areas at the same time. And really, I think what I was most concerned about was, what did the original investigators think? And what did the first cold case investigators think? And when I looked into that, it turns out that for the first two murders, the Vallejo investigators and the Solano County investigators didn't believe those were Zodiac at all. They believed they know who did it, and it was two members of a local drug gang who had murdered someone else and were on death row for a separate crime. And they also killed another guy named Matthew Burrell, and they didn't get prosecuted for that. They were on death row, and it seemed like they did the pragmatic thing and didn't do another trial. So these detectives have been trying to study this throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And the Zodiac community wasn't listening to that. These guys had done media appearances. They had been on TV saying that the first two murders were not Zodiac. Even Fincher himself is in a book with the cold case detectives, and they're saying that we're pretty satisfied that we know who did the first two murders and it's not Zodiac. And then Fincher says, I'm very interested in those two guys because they're psychopaths. And he knew how they had killed someone. They let the person run out of the car and then shot them 5 times in the back. It so happens that the first girl killed in the Zodiac, supposed Zodiac series is Betty Lou Jensen. And she, as she was running from a car, was also shot 5 times in the back. So Fincher doesn't cover the first two murders in his movie. And I think that's because he was convinced by the original investigators that those are not Zodiac, and they may be an inspiration for what Fincher believes inspiration for Zodiac.
You're saying it took you 3 years to just go through, or was it even longer, to go through all of this stuff and just start piecing all this together?
I was onto it fairly early, maybe 6 months into being very interested in this. I was like, oh, this is not ending up. And I think a lot of it was, I was just looking at similar cases and who was involved in those cases. And I was looking through the Zodiac reports and looking to see the names of people. And I would look those people up on Facebook. I would look them up on classmates.com. I would look them and shoot some of them a message. People who were in the paper, and I was getting court transcripts also of the guys that the original detectives thought did it. So I got their trial transcripts. And I started cold calling people and sending emails to people who testified at the trial. And some of them spoke to me. And there are things like, with the first murders, a white Impala was a car associated with the scene. I found out from the girlfriend of the person who supposedly confessed and the police thought did it, that her parents she was 16, her parents drove a white Impala. He had access to it. The murder weapon was a .22 pistol. He was convicted of 5 armed robberies with the .22 pistols. This is information that is not in any of the other Zodiac books, because it's either they didn't do the research or they did the research, found it inconvenient for the flowing narrative of the one Zodiac who commits the canonical murders as well as writes all the letters. And to me, that's preposterous.
Why do you think we're still talking about this all these years later?
Because he got away. And because he was media savvy, the letters they taunted the police, and then if you think about for the past 55 years, it's become a trope. The mastermind serial killer who taunts the police and plays cat and mouse with them. And that's the narrative we got throughout the 70s with Toschi, the San Francisco homicide inspector, and Zodiac, where it's this cat and mouse game between the two. And he was the inspiration for Steve McQueen's Bullet, and he was the inspiration for Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. And he's played by Mark Ruffalo in the film, and the film is very kind to him because he was also Robert Graysmith's main source of information. You know, he was an excellent investigator outside of Zodiac. He was a fantastic investigator. He was, you know, he probably got 100 murder convictions through his work. You know, he was an excellent investigator, but with Zodiac, he worked on it for 9 years and really got nowhere with it and made some strange investigative decisions that allowed him to be on this case for 9 years.
Do I remember reading correctly that he wrote some of the letters?
He did, yes. In the FBI file, it says that he wrote 3. His department, the San Francisco Police Department, cleared him of writing the letters, but that's a police internal investigation is not unbiased. And he admitted to writing letters to Amistad Maupin he was featured in Maupin's column, and he wrote fan letters, supposedly from college women and young women, talking about how, you know, they want more of him in the column, and we think Inspector Toschi is great. So he confessed to that part, but he was demoted, taken off Zodiac, taken out of homicide, and sent to the pawn shop detail, which is a punishment assignment. He's basically matching pawn tickets to stolen items. And his 2 bosses, and how you know something really happened was his 2 bosses were also demoted and transferred out. So the head of homicide and the head of intelligence. If he was truly not guilty of writing Zodiac letters, those 2 would have never been punished that way. And his chief went outside his own department and asked the FBI to examine each letter from when Toschi got on the case. So that's starting with the October 13th, 1969 letter through the April 24th, 1978 letter that he was accused of writing and the chief asked the FBI, are these from the same person? And this was in June. He was investigating in April. This was in June that the chief is asking the FBI this. And the FBI said they said it was inconclusive, but it is possible that the same person wrote those letters. And there's 4 original Zodiac letters not pertaining to the San Francisco crime. There's the 3-part cipher about the Vallejo murder, and there's the debut of Zodiac, which is August 4th, 1969, when he first names himself. And the FBI was convinced that those letters were all written by the same person. It says that in their files as well. But when asked to look at when San Francisco gets involved until there's a fake letter, the 78 letter. So they say inconclusive because I think there were a few photocopies included, which means they couldn't make a full decision on it, but they said inconclusive, but it may be the same person. So they didn't say like your guy didn't do it. You can read that however you want, but I think everybody in the Zodiac publishing community has read it differently than me. They've all read it to say that, oh yeah, everything's cool and he didn't do anything. Move on.
Did it ever become a federal case? You talk about the FBI having records and stuff. Were they investigating as well, or was it just a local matter?
It was a local matter. The FBI didn't investigate, but they assisted because they had print. Back then, it wasn't electronic or computerized fingerprints. So the FBI would have physical copies of criminals' fingerprints, and people who served in the military, they would have their fingerprints and their sort of enlistment cards. So they'd have a handwriting sample and a fingerprint sample. So the FBI they kept records of the case, and they would do an assist for the local cops. But the FBI could have been involved in the investigation. Early in the investigation, the FBI approached the 3 newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. And they asked the newspapers to press charges in an extortion case because the letters, according to the FBI at the time, he is saying that if you don't print the letter, he's going to go on a kill rampage. So they said that they can make an extortion case out of it. And the Vallejo Times-Herald said, yes, absolutely. We will cooperate with you on the extortion case. The 2 San Francisco papers did not cooperate. And interestingly, the Vallejo paper never got another letter from the Zodiac, and the rest of the communications went through the San Francisco papers only. So yeah, the FBI was thwarted from being on the investigation by the San Francisco papers' refusal to cooperate.
Mm. Now, is that kind of representing the Graysmith character, the Jake Gyllenhaal character?
No, he was a cartoonist. He had very little involvement with the newspaper or any of the decision making or, frankly, the people in the movie. He didn't actually know Paul Avery. Avery said he met him like twice. So throughout the film, there's this relationship between, Robert Downey and Jake Gyllenhaal, and they're like a buddy team in the movie, but they didn't really have any relationship in real life. Yeah, but Jake Gyllenhaal is at the Chronicle. So Robert Smith is at the Chronicle, and he had Toschi helping him. He met Toschi in 1977. He had Toschi helping him get information about the case, and he was the first person before these records were made. Well, some of these records were made public. He saw the information first, and he wrote the first well thought of book based on, at least partially, on the police files with the 1986 book Zodiac.
Sorry, I should probably say I know that David Fincher's movie is not a documentary by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm sorry, I'm just relating real life people to the movie just because that's what's most familiar with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a picture in your head. I don't know what Robert Graysmith looks like in real life, but I know what Jake Gyllenhaal looks like. No,
exactly.
I don't know who Arthur Leigh Allen looks like in real life, but I love John Carroll Lynch, and his performance in that movie is stunning.
But now I can't see him as anything else. Every time I see him in something, I'm like, it's Leigh Allen, man. There he is. It goes Leigh Allen again.
Luckily, I just picture him either as being in bed with Marge Gunderson from Fargo or burning to death in that volcano movie with Tommy Lee Jones.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm stuck on that interview scene of, with Toschi and Mullinex with the Zodiac watch. And, that's a great scene in the Fincher film. And I hate to say it, but he's typecast forever as Leigh Allen in my mind.
What was the real guy like when it comes to him? What was Arthur Leigh Allen like in real life?
He was a very intelligent guy. He had sort of eccentric interests. He was in the Navy for 10 years. He was court-martialed. He had a gun on base. He was a child molester. He was a convicted child molester, and he was fired from a number of jobs. He was a school teacher, and he was fired from a teaching job for touching children. He was fired from a job at a gas station for being drunk at work and leering at children. So he lived in his mother's basement. He was a smart guy. He was a really good athlete. He was a diver, and he was like a great diver and swimmer. And his life went off the rails, and he turns into this. And he went to prison. He was convicted of child molestation, and he has this sort of sad life where he is this alcoholic who lives in the basement and, is a child molester. So in my mind, at least partially, I believe Arthur Leigh Allen liked the attention of being Zodiac, and he liked being thought of the killer that was smarter than the police. And if he's going to be locked up, it would seem a lot better for him to be associated with Zodiac than to be what he really was, a child molester in prison. And so the Zodiac connection a little bit worked in his favor. I think he may have leaned into it a little bit, but the watch he had, he was a diver, and that was a diving watch, the Zodiac watch with the same symbol. His brother had one too. They both got it Christmas 1967 from their mother. It was a fairly common watch amongst divers at the time in the late 50s and 70s. But yeah, that is true. He did have the Zodiac watch, but that's not necessarily evidence. It's a wild coincidence. But yeah, not a good man by any stretch.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know what they do to child molesters in prison, and I imagine being Zodiac would have a much bigger cachet.
Yeah, I think it afforded him maybe, I don't want to say respect, but fear or something more so than what he was. I think he abused like a 5-year-old boy or something like that. It's just lousy. And yeah, so he improved his reputation with the Zodiac connections.
Eddie, you're doing this job where you're taking away the mystique. There was no bra burning in the feminist movement. The relationship of Bugliosi and Manson is questionable here in your intro and everything. And then you're just pissing all over all these theories of the Zodiac. You're taking away all the fun, man.
I'm the kid who's like the first one to be like wrestling is scripted. And I feel terrible about it sometimes. And I've gotten emails from people who have been longtime Zodiac researchers, and they're like, basically like, I read your book, the research is fantastic, but you ruined everything. And I don't know how to feel about that, because I'm happy that this person enjoyed the read, but I don't know if they enjoyed it. I guess they liked the work, and they looked at some newspaper.com articles, and they looked at some of the things I was researching, and they were like, okay, you're right about this, but you basically ruined the whole thing. And there were people who posted on Zodiac, chat boards, and they were like longtime posters on them, and they're not enthusiastic so much since the book came out in March. A few people anyway, not everyone. A lot of people choose to ignore it or, disparage me. But some people I had spoken to are like, I don't care about posting about this anymore. This is, I think you kind of nailed at least 3/4 of it, and I was just, that's, if I could do half, if I could do 25%, I'd be happy. People are responding to it, but like the kid who said there's no such thing as Santa Claus. And, the next day you're like, then is the Easter Bunny real? Then is the Tooth Fairy real? And I think I've got some of those conversations going, which, I don't like relish that. Like, I feel like I did take something away from people. I was devastated to learn that the Iron Sheik and Hacksaw Jim Duggan like smoked weed together. When I was a kid, I thought they were like bitter rivals, and they got arrested in New Jersey for we were in a car together. And, when I was a kid, and it was devastating. So I feel like I'm doing that with true crime the true crime industrial complex. They had Zodiac. That was their guy. This was such a great story that made sense. And, he was the genius code killer, the mastermind. And I'm just like, yeah, it's cops already know that 2 other people did this. And there was a serial cab robber who killed someone else in Presidio Heights. And if you look at, you take away the mystique, Darlene Ferrin, the victim on the 4th of July, she had a stalker. And a very dangerous guy who had broken into her house, threatened to rape her, who bragged at a strip club about killing her, who had abused his wife and had a restraining order. And this is the real suspect. This is not a mystery man. This is not and the cops looked at him for maybe a week, and then they went on strike, and then never looked at him again. And it's just, it's a series of fumbles throughout this book, but I came across a lot of Solano County, Napa County murders that, especially women at the time, that they were trying to brush under the rug. Another suspect in Darlene's murder was a police officer she was dating named Chuck Lindsay. And in 1972, Chuck Lindsay, his girlfriend, shot herself with his .357 in the stomach, killing herself at his house, just feet away from her children in the other room, which is an unlikely scenario. And, so there's no justice for her. The strip club this guy, George Waters, Darlene's stalker, was bragging about killing Darlene. The manager of that strip club, she was shot in the back of the head, and the police initially tried to say it was a suicide, and it was forensically and physically impossible for that to be the case.
Shooting yourself in the stomach doesn't seem like the way that you'd want to go.
No, and it's incredibly rare for a woman to shoot herself with a high caliber weapon as a suicide, especially when her kids are just like mere feet away. And this guy was the Solano County Sheriff's Department evidence officer. He was in charge of fingerprints and crime scene photos. And apparently his roommate told Robert Graysmith that he had photos of Darlene Ferrin, crime scene photos, or, of Darlene Ferrin in his kitchen on the wall. And he's a pretty bad guy. I had spoken to some, people who knew him, and he was, not great. I heard some, like off the record, not a lot of pretty lousy things. And so there's 2 very dangerous men in Darlene Ferrin's life, and neither of them is a mysterious code killer, and neither of them is her ex-husband, who the police didn't even bother talking to. Now, this is July 4th of 1969. The first person you should talk to is the husband, anyone she's having an affair with, and then the ex-husband. And the ex-husband they didn't speak to until February of 1970. And that's only because a psychic was on television and mentioned his name. So they were sort of forced into action to speak to this ex-husband who ticks a lot of Zodiac boxes. But I think the other 2 suspects are far better suspects, but it's negligent not to look into this man, and they don't talk to him until 70.
The psychic, is that the Brian Cox character?
Oh no, Brian Cox was Melvin Belli, an attorney. He was like the F. Lee Belli. He was like the number 2 attorney in the country at the time, and a fraudulent caller who may have been calling from a mental institution asked to go on the Jim Dunbar show, and the Zodiacs, claiming to be the Zodiac, would go on the Jim Dunbar show, and Brian Cox plays Melvin Belli, He was a lawyer for a lot of famous people. I think he was Jack Ruby's attorney. He was like pretty much did it for free. Pretty much any kind of like celebrity case at the time. He was like, I guess, the Johnny Cochran of his era. And he also, like, another, a lot of people in this case milked it for publicity, is Zodiac connection. And that's unfortunate. The psychic was someone in Chicago, I think, that Darlene's family, it was like an Italian-born psychic that Darlene's family had hired to help when the investigation was going nowhere. And the psychic brought up her husband, and cops didn't bother looking at him until this happened. So yeah, I mean, it's brutal when you look at, I mean, this is not glamorous. Fincher's not going to make a movie about this, about the cops doing their job, going on strike and then not investigating their suspect anymore, or one of the suspects actually being a cop in that case. That they didn't even release records on that. That's Graysmith had to find that out from Vallejo police in the 70s. The Vallejo police have released a bunch of their Zodiac police reports, but there's nothing about this Chuck Lindsay that they looked at. And he was the suspect in, I believe, August of 69. So an early suspect.
You mentioned the term code killer, and obviously that's one of the biggest things for me when I think about Zodiac is the code. How quickly did they solve that cipher?
The first one, I believe, was solved within a week, the 3-part cipher. And it was 2 school teachers from Salinas, California, a husband and wife, and they were code enthusiasts. They weren't professional code crackers, but I believe the Naval Intelligence or the NSA and the FBI signed off on their solution that they had gotten that one right. And for one of the other codes, it took until 2020, and it was a team of mathematicians and computer scientists and cipher experts, and it took 55 years to solve that one, and or 50 years. It took a long time to solve that one. And there's still 2 that are unsolved. There's a 13 that's unsolved, but likely it's too small in scope to be solved. I saw a video from David Fincher, who is an expert who solved the code in 2020, the Z340. And I think he came up with 240,000 names that fit, or some absurd number of names that fit into that code. A lot of people have over the years claimed that they solved that one, and it's hard to verify. And when an actual expert who cracked an actual Zodiac code that was thought to be uncrackable says it's, there's probably not enough there, I'll go with his opinion on that.
Yeah. Has anybody just gone to the source and asked Ted Cruz if it was him?
I mean, I wish he was harassed more about it. That would be nice. It would be nice if people called him every day, and he sort of woke up in the middle of the night all about the Zodiac. But unfortunately, I think people dropped that once.
It was a good bit. I really liked it.
Yeah. I think our president accused his dad of being involved in the Kennedy assassination during the campaign, and then Cruz dropped out the next day. Not that I don't think his dad had anything to do with the Kennedy assassination, but funny.
What was the most surprising thing that you found during all this research? Because it sounds like you were just doing bombshell after bombshell.
People were saying that they are losing their breath reading the book, or screamed out loud reading the book. The most shocking thing to me was Dave Toschi, which is, again, Mark Ruffalo's character. And I can show that throughout the 70s, he was planting stories in the San Francisco newspapers about crimes that never committed, that he was the hero of responding to, or crimes that were committed. And then he was sending in letters to a columnist named Guy Wright, or the paper itself, and under assumed names of civilians who, and if you look at Polk's city register, they did not exist in San Francisco in the years they supposedly wrote these letters to the Chronicle and the Examiner praising Toschi. So there's all these like wild letters that's like, it's like there's a story about how like an Iranian general's son was murdered, which never happened, by the way, in San Francisco or in the United States. It's a crime that never happened. And then there's a story on Christmas Eve from a girl named Angel thanking Toschi for telling her about how her sister and her sister's boyfriend were arrested in this crime. It's this ridiculous story that obviously isn't true because he's a homicide detective. Why is he going to a hotel and doing this? And then a barrage of letters come into the paper, like we need more men like Toschi in a city of liberals and psychiatrists. We have Toschi. And like the letters are just, then there's another one about a Vietnamese immigrant who had helped hotel staff detain a killer. And the letters are very tone deaf because they're not about the hero of the story being the Vietnamese immigrant. They're about Dave Toschi is going to nominate this guy for Citizen of the Year. And it's all these letters about how awesome Toschi is. And so he's pulling this bit throughout the 70s. So in the film, the character is very, he's embarrassed to be Dirty Harry, and he doesn't like when the newspapers are scooping stories about Zodiac in Riverside. And in real life, he brings the circus to Riverside. He brings his buddy Sherwood Morrill, the question document expert, and he unbelievably, but he did this in real life. There was an etching on a desk, and he matches the etching on the desk to the felt pen letters written by Zodiac. So another absurd, it's just absurdity after absurdity after absurdity. And, it wouldn't be the same type of thriller as Fincher's film, which, I love Fincher's film, but there's a movie there about, the adventures of Dave Toschi in the 70s. And it's just, it's hard to believe. And I had to keep verifying it. And then I spoke to reporters who worked back then and other cops that worked back then. And off the record, they, I guess, obviously I can't use off the record things in my book, but off the record, they're brutal. They're like that after San Francisco cop who wrote the letters, and the letters, like there's no may have, could have, may have done three. They take these in for a penny and for a pound kind of with a lot of the letters. And it's wholly different than what's presented in Fincher's film, which is a 2-second scene basically about internal affairs talks to him, and then they transfer him out about the letter when Mopin accused him.
How do you say to yourself, okay, now is the time that I can start to write this? Because obviously you're doing all this research. When is that moment where you actually can do that? And then also a follow-up, when is the moment where you say, okay, this is it. I've packed everything into this book. I really can't go any farther than this, because I imagine you could probably talk about this and study this just like all of the other Zodiac enthusiasts.
Yes, absolutely. I am as obsessed as anyone else. And if the premise of the movie was obsession, I'm guilty of that. I was researching this for years, and a friend of mine, Mike Louie, he does a thing called House of No in Brooklyn, KNOW. And it's monthly lectures, and it's generally on spooky or esoteric topics. And I had spoken to him about my Zodiac research. I had just written a novel, and we were talking about my Zodiac research at the book release party. And he was like, come down and give a 45-minute talk about the Zodiac. And I did, and people were really into it. So I thought I had something there. And, I had written 3 books prior to this, 2 fiction, 1 short story collection, 1 crime novel, and 1 cookbook. I had never done true crime or nonfiction before, but I realized I had something when I presented it for an audience, and they were like, tell me more. It took maybe 2 years to write it, I think. And I wish I could update it every day. I think I find out one crazy thing per week that, nothing that changes any of the premise. And it's things that only back up what I found, but I find out something wild every week. And since the book has come out, people have contacted me, and it bolsters my position. So if there's a second edition of this, I can bolster a lot of my positions with some really interesting information. But it's nothing that refutes where I was going. It just makes it make a little more sense.
Obviously, you're not writing the end in March 2026, and then the book comes out the next day. You're writing that probably a lot earlier, and then there's all of the process of everything the Frail House has to do. But in the months since you've written the end, have you been able to divorce yourself enough to think about what that next project is?
Hope so. I haven't been able to divorce myself fully. I still have one foot in Zodiac, and I am still emailing with sources, people I had spoke to, people who were teenagers back then, people who knew the victims, people who knew the suspects. I'm still in contact with some of those people. I haven't, since I finished the book, I haven't found anything earth shattering. I think this will lead to my next project. I think I found a real serial killer in the research of a fake serial killer. I think the person who committed the first 2 Zodiac murders may be responsible for 4 murders and 2 attempted murders. And he was sort of a celebrity inmate in the 80s. He was on the Geraldo Rivera show. He's a really interesting character. I have a ton of information about him in this book, but I wonder if I can expand that into something. And, and the other thing is, if I was thinking about true crime, a case that bothers me and I really would like to know more about, and I could see myself getting re-obsessed with because I was obsessed with it as a teenager, is the West Memphis 3 case. During the satanic panic, 3 metalhead kids, one of them was on death row for supposedly murdering 3 young boys in a satanic ritual murder. The trial was a farce. And, they eventually had to take an Alford plea where they pled guilty in order to come off of death row and be free. But, one of them works with the Innocence Project now. And one of them he does the retreats and, a lot of meditation and Western esotericism. And they're interesting human beings. And I would really like to know who got away with that.
I've got my own theories about that one after watching those documentaries. Holy cow.
Those documentaries are wild. And I had, in the early 2000s, do you know the dad, John Mark Byers, the long-haired dad? I had corresponded with him quite a bit in the early. He has since passed in a car accident, but I had corresponded with him quite a bit, and he came around to being a supporter of the West Memphis 3. Initially, he thought they did it, and he was a troubled guy. He had substance issues, and what's a nice way to say this? When he did very flamboyant stunts for the camera, he was given some cash. He was able to buy some substances with that. So he learned pretty quickly that the more outrageous he was and the more sort of over the top he was, the more likely he was going to be able to afford what he was looking for to numb his pain. And really interesting guy. But he did come around to supporting the 3 boys who were in prison at the time. And I don't think he lived to see them get out. I think he died maybe in 2010 and they got out in 2011 or something like that.
It's got to be a little bit of a relief to some of these families when you're able to say, listen, your loved one was probably not killed by a mysterious serial killer we still can't solve this crime.
I wish the police would come out and say that. They've known, I believe Solano County is known since 1970. Solano County and Vallejo have probably known since 70. They had a confession. They had numerous witnesses. They had someone who was part of the criminal gang, an outlaw biker who was the drug supplier to this gang, who gave up the shooter in this. Made the paper, but on page 18, and it made the paper 2 times. I think it was the Vallejo Times Herald and maybe the Benicia Herald, and that's not the story because at the time it's 70. Zodiac is in full swing, and it's Zodiac versus Toschi. So the story of a local drug gang and a kid who may have snitched on them isn't very appealing at the time. But again, the original detectives, John Lynch and George Bauer, they were going on these tabloid TV shows in the 80s, Geraldo and whatnot, and all these shows, and they were saying that the first 2 are not Zodiac. So they've tried, and people a lot closer to that job have tried to do it a lot closer than I have. I'm a civilian on the other side of the country. They've tried to get this information out there. And it just seems that people are unwilling to accept it. It's not that they're uninterested, they're unwilling to accept it. But you have to look past it to keep the story alive because it's the foundation of Zodiac. Because if you take that away, you take away the letters were something about only Zodiac and the police knew. The killer and the police are the only ones who know this. And you take that away, the myth starts crumbling right away from the very beginning. And the Vallejo chief was skeptical of the July 31st 3-part cipher right away. He said, this information's in the newspaper. He wasn't convinced of it. And, and then their officers, and this is in one Grace's last book called Shooting Zodiac. There's tons of information about this, that the Vallejo detectives were getting a lot of information from the drug world about who really did the Lake Herman Road murders. And it was Dave McGrath, Magris, who was a local drug dealer who was on death row for a different murder. And he could be the main character in this. But unfortunately, the investigation didn't go that way. They, I think the DA had said that there's no, the gun was thrown in the bay. well, when they were on trial for the other murder, the 22 was thrown in the bay. So he didn't want to prosecute them without it. And it was already a hassle to get these guys on death row in the first place. It was a very long trial, a very difficult trial. And, this guy completely perjured himself, this character. So I don't think the DA wanted to go through all that again in 70. So he just allowed justice to be the fact that in 1970, they believed California still had the death penalty. And maybe that's how he slept at night.
Eddie, where's the best place for people to keep up with you and your work?
Probably Instagram, Eddie McNamara NYC. I post on Instagram. I have a website, eddie-mcnamara.com, but I don't really know how to update it that much. So probably, on social, probably Instagram or Facebook or something like that.
Eddie McNamara, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. This was so much fun talking with you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. This is fantastic.